Superintendent of Indian Affairs, Clark W. Thompson, had been tasked with setting up the Crow Creek Reservation in the wasteland region of Fort Thompson, South Dakota, a place which became for just under 2,000 Ho-Chunks a veritable death camp. Within exactly 1 week of the arrival of the last Ho-Chunk group to the reservation, Thompson began to report unusual behavior among them. He didn't realize it at the time, but he was witnessing the beginnings of a bold last-ditch effort of the Ho-Chunk people to preserve the lives of their families. Follow their trail on location. A puzzled Superintendent Thompson wrote on July 1st, 1863, that Ho-Chunk families were destroying their timber by peeling the standing trees. They take for canoes the saw logs that my employees have cut, and fall trees across our roads. They have kept up every annoyance that they could invent, until I have been obliged to send soldiers after them, and punish them by confinement. What Thompson interpreted to be erratic annoyances and thieving was the commencement of a survival strategy. The unusual timber-related activity was at the roots of their plan to escape. Ho-Chunks addressed the terrors they faced at Crow Creek by applying their ancient craft of dugout canoe construction. Cottonwood, the only abundant wood species on the reserve, had a reputation of being useless as firewood and lumber. But a 3-foot diameter tree could make a good, sound canoe. It wasn't long before canoes began taking shape, and Ho-Chunk families began slipping down the Missouri River. Brigadier General Alfred Sully reported in mid-July that he had passed by Crow Creek Reservation and was detained there due to low water levels. He reflected on Ho-Chunk prospects at this place. Their fate has been harder than that of most Indian tribes. They have been more frequently removed by order of the government in the last few years than most tribes. Their last removal from Minnesota was hard for them, for they were not implicated in the late massacres. In the selection of their new locality for their reservation, I do not think good judgment has been used. The land is poor. I don't think you can depend on a crop of corn even once in 5 years, as it seldom rains here in the summer. There is no hunting in their immediate vicinity, and the bands of Sioux near here are hostile to them. They, the Winnebagos, tell me they are friends of the Omahas, and speak nearly the same language. It is their wish to be united with them on the Omaha Reservation, and, as they say, the Omahas are in favor of this also. These Ho-Chunks were making a plea to Sully for government acquiescence to their plan. They were not asking for permission, though. They were stating their intentions as fact. They would not wait for the treaty trail's legal process this time. The echo of axes declared Ho-Chunk canoe builders' determination to act. General Sully warned that they would be, quote, fired on by my troops stationed down the river if they left without permission. But the people were not dissuaded, for death stared them in the face at Crow Creek, too. They were willing to take the risk. Ho-Chunk families left singly and in groups, bound for Nebraska and the reservation of their distant ancestral relatives, the Omaha Nation. I have to report that small detachments of Winnebagos are constantly arriving in canoes, locating on our reserve, and begging for food to keep them from starving. Omaha Indian Agent O.H. Irish was reporting the early outcome of the Ho-Chunk people's plan to escape Crow Creek. Ho-Chunk exiles were granted permission by the Omaha Nation to take refuge among them until permanent arrangements could be made. Following the trickle that summer, a large number departed from Crow Creek in the autumn. This group was detained at Fort Randall, and after a tenuous winter, they too made it to Nebraska. Hundreds more followed the next year, leaving only about 600 at Crow Creek by autumn of 1864, and these merely having not yet started out. The Ho-Chunk families who were then arriving in Nebraska had largely navigated the previous decades by assenting to remove wherever the U.S. government had dictated. Now, they were living in legal limbo. Their pact with the Omaha Nation would not necessarily hold water with the U.S. government, just as their agreement with Wabashaw's band during their move from the neutral ground to Lawn Prairie was nullified. Ho-Chunk families would have to wait and see, for although they had made an official request to have a reservation formalized in Nebraska, government officials had no solidified intentions yet. Today, Ho-Chunk people link the U.S. military service of Chief Little Priest to the government's 1865 decision to allow them to remain in Nebraska. A treaty was drawn up on March 6, 1865, by which this part of the Ho-Chunk Nation purchased 1/3 of the Omaha Reservation. This treaty, which was really more of a ratification of an agreement between the Ho-Chunks and Omahas, would in retrospect be the final one on the Ho-Chunk Nation's treaty trail. The reservation established by this treaty was a 153,600-acre piece of land just south of Sioux City, Iowa, and north of Omaha, Nebraska. It fronted on the Missouri River for 4 miles, and then plunged into the interior, where it expanded to an 8-mile width. The center of the reservation agency became the modern-day city of Winnebago, Nebraska. Although this land differed from that of Minnesota, Iowa, and Wisconsin, crops grew well for the neighboring Omaha, and there was at least some usable firewood timber. Interior waterways, which had been a key component of all reservations prior to Crow Creek, were scarce, with no major watersheds centered on this land. It fronted on the Missouri River just as the Crow Creek Reservation had, but the utter desolation of the Fort Thompson region was not as apparent here. During their first full summer on the land, their traditional crops grew once again. The experiences of this group of Nebraska Ho-Chunk families over the decades of forced expulsion were structured by the treaty trail which had wound hundreds of miles beyond their homeland. Simultaneously, Ho-Chunks who had remained in their ancestral lands faced their own Trail of Tears experience right in the midst of the Wisconsin communities we know today. It was an experience that was similar in some ways to the treaty trail, but one with its own unique set of challenges. The challenges of existing as a people group in a perpetual condition of insecurity as they resided in a state which neither sanctioned their presence as a tribal entity nor as citizens. It meant adapting year by year to meet the changes being wrought in a rapidly transforming Wisconsin. It meant forfeiting annual payments which had been promised as compensation for their land. A new exhibit at the historic Indian Agency House, slated to open in 2024, investigates the Wisconsin contingent's story during this era. Although the path diverged for those who clung to Wisconsin and those who followed the treaty trail to Nebraska, their respective Trail of Tears experiences crossed paths at intervals. Sometimes it was on a large scale, as Wisconsin's Ho-Chunk families were subjected to repeated mass expulsions to the reservations, such as around 1850 to Lawn Prairie. Sometimes it involved individuals, such as Chief Dandy, one of the heads of what became known as the Wisconsin Band, who were hunted down and deported to the reservation as a symbolic statement to others. Often these parallel paths intersected when individuals fled the reservations and returned to Wisconsin, exchanging the challenges of the treaty trail for the equal, although distinctive challenges of existing as fugitives in their homeland. "8 years after the reservation had been established in Nebraska, Ho-Chunks in Wisconsin faced what would be the final in a long series of military-backed expulsion drives, 40 years after the first one in 1833. In the midst of the events leading up to this final removal, the government commissioner appointed to the task assembled a delegation of Ho-Chunks from Nebraska to travel to Wisconsin for the purpose of convincing Wisconsin's Ho-Chunks to go to the reservation. This culminated in a council at Big Springs, Wisconsin, on August 19, 1873. Gray Wolf and Little Decorah could not offer much inducement to remove to Nebraska, and advised their Wisconsin relatives, saying that they stayed in Nebraska because they were compelled to, that they were poor and fared badly, that but a small portion of the west bank of the Missouri River is woodland, and the little there is large cottonwood, which you know is not fit for wood by any means, green or dry, that their money is all used in what agents call improvements, and that they lack for sufficient supply from their farms, so that they have no money at any time, nor any means of getting any. The expulsion would potentially double the number of people coexisting on the same amount of land in Nebraska, and Nebraska chiefs worried about the results for all involved. An act of Congress in 1874 bolstered the reservation's resources with an additional parcel of timberland from the Omaha Nation. But when the removals came, conditions on the reservation became desperate. Those who had been forced from Wisconsin sought the soonest opportunity to return over the subsequent months. Thus, Ho-Chunk families continued into the future as one people in two geographically separated bands, one in Nebraska and one centered in Wisconsin. Although the Wisconsin group was eventually recognized by the federal government, they were treated as a separate nation from the Nebraska Ho-Chunks, and still are today. Although the treaty-defined Trail of Tears had ended for Ho-Chunks after the final removal efforts in 1873, the story does not end there. In 1887, efforts to dissolve Ho-Chunk lands in Nebraska by piecemeal allotment of the land to individuals, just as the government had attempted at Blue Earth, resulted in only 1/3 of the reservation remaining in Ho-Chunk hands by the first decade of the 20th century. It is a problem which continues to erode at the tribe's land base in the present. The boarding school era impacted Ho-Chunk youth both in Nebraska and in Wisconsin, as government strategies endeavored to strip cultural identity from the next generation. The horrors of nationwide Indian boarding schools are just now coming to light in the present day. Children were taken from their families, abused, and denied the right to speak their language. The boarding school era for Ho-Chunks is not something of the distant past. In 1920, federal law required that all Native children be educated in these institutions. The Genoa Indian School in Nebraska remained operational until 1934. The Tomah, Wisconsin Indian Industrial School remained in operation until 1941, and others operated nationwide until the 1970s. The lasting repercussions of forced assimilation are extensive. But today's Ho-Chunk families continue to press onward, fighting hard to preserve their language and culture. In the words of the Ho-Chunk Nation Language Department, the Ho-Chunk, or the people of the sacred voice, are resilient. They know both prosperous times and difficult times, yet they have persevered. And the trail continues on.